On your drive here, you probably noticed all those billboards up with people's faces and fun slogans, and and it means one thing, it means two things. Number one, that election season is upon us, but also graffiti season is upon us. Elections, right? So a couple of weeks ago, I was having dinner out there after the service, which most of you should be at, I think. All of you should sign up. And I was talking with someone, and they started chatting politics with me. And I was like, you know what? We should talk about it in the evening, because we got who can vote this year? Yeah, most of us. Yeah, that's probably something we should talk about. So I just want to say that at the outset, this message is not brought to you by any political party. I have no affiliation with any political party. I'm not a Green, Labour, National, Young Nat, ACT, any of those groups. I got nothing to do with any of them. So tonight, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. And what we're just going to do, we're going to open the Bible and see what God has to say about government, politics, and all that fun stuff. And I guess you prayerfully make up your own mind. So you can see up there our reference. So get your Bibles out. Turn there, please. And you should know by now that you got to have your Bible in front of you, not your phone. Don't let your phone distract you, eh? It'll get you. So let's turn to 1 Peter, chapter 2, verses 13 to 17. If you should, we spent 2 years in this book, 1 Peter, in the evening service, so you should know, but I'll just do a quick recap. Written by the Apostle Peter, and he's writing to Christians who were being persecuted. They were under all sorts for being Christians, and he's trying to encourage them, hey, this is how you live your life in light of the fact that we're under persecution. I guess there's a big overall message saying that Christians, you don't belong here. This is not your home. You are sojourners. You are exiles. You're just journeying through here. So with that perspective, live as citizens of another kingdom. And that's his encouragement through 1 Peter. And so it's kind of like, in a world that isn't Christian, here's how you live like a Christian. And so we get to this point in the letter, which talks about how Christians relate to the government, how we respond to governing authorities. And let's see, verse 13, just before our text in verse 13, it talks about how we're sojourners, right? We're exiles. We don't really belong here. But what this is kind of telling us is that even though we don't belong here, next page, even though we don't belong here, we still participate in this world, right? It's not a case of, this isn't our home, so just stuff it. We still faithfully participate, which is why I think it infers that we should probably vote if you are able to. I wouldn't make a hard and fast rule about it, but I think it's kind of pointing us in that direction that, hey, if you're able to and you can in good conscience do so, I think we probably should vote. But if someone decides not to, I'm not going to judge anyone over that. So as we go through this passage, we're kind of looking at this idea of, as Christians, how do we engage in the fun world of politics? So let me read from 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. Okay, so we got 5 points this evening, and don't worry, some of them will just zoom through like super quickly. So first thing I want us to notice is, as Christians, dabbling in politics, number one is that we have to realize our identity. Realize your identity as servants of God. If you look at the text, you'll see that it says, live as people who are free. That's talking about who we are. And it says, as servants of God. Servants of God. So when it says live as people who are free, what Peter's saying there is that we're living as people who are free, like ultimately free from being under the subjection of the emperor. Like the main point, the overarching point is that this is not our ultimate allegiance or our ultimate authority. We live as people who are free from that, and instead we live as people who are servants of God. This is what happens when we become Christians. We were slaves to sin, and then by God's grace, He saves us, and then we become slaves to Christ. So we live as servants of God. We belong to a greater king. That's King Jesus. So going back a few verses, you'll notice it says, and I've mentioned this already, that we're sojourners and exiles. So one of the first things we got to remember is as we engage in politics is we got to do so in such a way that shows our identity as people who are servants of God. So we're kingdom people. We belong to the kingdom of God. So we're not national people. We're not labor people. We're not act blah, blah, blah. Any of those things. We belong to the kingdom of God, and that is our identity. We're servants of God. That's our ultimate authority and allegiance. We got to remember that. That's where it all starts. Realize your identity as servants of God. That's the first thing. Second point is we have to respect the government and we have to submit to the government. So look at the text there. It says, be subject to every human institution, the emperor, governors, and so on. So this applies to all human institutions. So we're talking about police. Do we have any police in here? No? Okay, but it applies to police. It applies to teachers. Surely we got some teachers. Yeah, there you go. We got one teacher. It applies to your teachers, your bosses at work. All human institutions were supposed to submit and respect the authorities, but government in particular that we're talking about tonight. So what that means is Christians, we pay our taxes. Christians, we keep to the speed limit. We submit to the government. Right? But more than that, it's not just a case of the government says don't do A, B, C, D. It's not a case of just okay, I'm not going to do that. But if you look at the text, it also says that we should be doing good. We should be doing good, looking for ways to do good and be a blessing. Because what that does, what our obeying and respecting and submitting to the government does, is it honors God. It says here that we do it for the Lord's sake. This is the will of God. And here's why this honors God. When we obey, when we keep to the speed limit, when we don't jump in bus lanes, when we don't run red lights, unless your wife is in labor, and all 7 traffic lights happen to be red, then you can run those. But when we obey the government and submit to the rules that they make, and the laws they set out, it honors God because God is the one who established the government. He is the one who has put that authority in place. Even the bad ones. I know you're going to come up to me after and be like, yeah, but what about the Nazis? And what about, I don't know, insert other political party. What the Bible tells us is that all governing authorities, good or bad, is from God. God established them. So I kind of like how we spoke about a couple of weeks ago about why God allows bad things to happen. The premise behind this is just kind of man, we don't know the mind of God. His ways are far above our ways. And so even when we think about what? The Nazi party? Blah, blah, I don't know, man. I don't know how it works. God's a lot smarter than I am. And He established those governments. And so that's what we go with. Here's what Romans 13 says. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. So if a governing authority exists, Romans is telling us that it has been instituted by God. Now, I'm telling you, hey, as Christians, we got to obey the government. So then the question is, when do we disobey the government? When should there be a civil disobedience? Because we might not like some of the laws that they make, and using Nazi Germany as an example, like, should Christians have gone along and been like, yeah, stuff the Jews and blah, blah, like, should Christians have done that? Well, there is a time for Christians to disobey the government, and one needs to consider thoughtfully and prayerfully with wise counsel as to when that might be. So it's not just a case of like, oh, man, I don't like that law that says you have to drive, under 50 Ks or whatever. I think that's restricting my freedoms and blah, blah, blah. I'm going to do 100 on East Coast Road. I don't know if that's how it works. I can't tell you where the line is, but, little things like that are definitely well within the lines. So there are times when we can disobey the government. I think it comes down to the fact that we are obeying the government for the Lord's sake. That's what the text says. It says it's for the Lord's sake. And so we got to figure out, okay, what times are laws like just grossly disobeying God? So, for example, having your phone on at church. There's always context to every law, right? So, like, if there was a law, and I'm sure, I don't know if it's written down, but maybe it's just common sense. But if there was a law that says, like, hey, you can't break into someone's home and preach the gospel to them, you can't be like, nah, that's telling me to stop preaching the gospel. I'm going to disobey that. And you break into your neighbor's house and be like, yeah, turn or burn. Like, that's not, do you know what I mean? But sometimes we got to think about, okay, there are times we need to disobey the government when it comes, when it's not for the Lord's sake, when it's in direct opposition to what God has to say. And we see this in the Bible, right? So, for example, in Exodus, this new Egyptian king comes along, and he's like, man, there's a lot of Jews around. They're going to get a lot of power, and that's going to be dangerous. So, hey, midwives, when the Jewish woman gives birth and it's a boy, I need you to kill them. And if you remember the text, it tells us that they feared God and not Pharaoh, so they decided, no, we're going to disobey the government here. We're going to let the boys live. And then they come up with that hilarious excuse of like, no, the Hebrew woman, they're just so onto it that they just give birth before we can even get there. So we see that. And what about Daniel? Daniel chapter 3, where the people are forced to worship pagans. King Nebuchadnezzar's like, yeah, hey, when you hear the harp and this music and stuff, you got to worship. And Daniel's guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are like, yo, we're not going to do that. And Nebuchadnezzar's like, hey, if you don't do this, we're going to chuck you in the fire. And do you remember what they say? They're like, hey, you can do that. We're going to worship Yahweh. Our God will save us. Our God can save us. And even if he doesn't save us, we're going to stay loyal. They disobeyed the government. What about in Acts chapter 5? So the apostles, they're preaching the gospel. They get arrested for it because the authorities are like, oh, we don't like this. They get chucked into jail. An angel comes along, lets them out of jail. And then they, as free people, hey, don't let your phone distract you, man. It's funny because we were talking about phones distracting us before the service. But the angel comes, releases them from jail, and then if it was like you or I, we got imprisoned for it, we'll probably be like, man, I'm going to chill on the preaching just for a little bit, lay low. But then they get out and they're straight back at it, and they start preaching the gospel. And then the authorities are like, bro, why are you doing this? Like, stop doing that. Stop preaching the gospel. And they say, oh, sorry, man, we got to obey God. Like, our responsibility is to obey God. We must obey God rather than men. So there is a time for Christians to not submit to the government, but only when it comes grossly in conflict with what God commands of us. But what I want us to notice there is that in times where Christians disobey the government, it's always done humbly, it's always done non-militantly, non-aggressively. So if Chris Hipkins makes a law tomorrow that we don't like, storm the beehive. We don't do that. Christians don't participate in that. Do you remember what happened when people came to arrest Jesus? And Peter's whips out a sword, chops off Malchus's ear, and what did Jesus say to him? Was he like, yeah, nice shot, bro. Get the other one. No, he said, no. Pops the ear back on, and he says, man, that's not how we do things. Christians aren't people of violence. Not talking about like self-defense, but we don't go out to cause violence on people. He says, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. That's not the Christian way. So when Christians disobey the government, when we defy the government, it's done humbly and non-aggressively. And when we obey God, when we obey the government, we're obeying God, so it's a good witness. It says, put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. This is a massive witness. Put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. It's basically saying, like, they can't bring any charge against you. So, man, like it or not, Christians, we got to be model citizens. Like, when people jump in the car with you, we can't have that reputation of being the guy who goes 50K over the speed limit, or he's the guy that's going to, run the red lights or whatever. That can't be our reputation. And it silences the ignorance of people. That's what it says. And if you consider what is the ignorance that's being talked about here, well, the ignorance, it's talking about those who oppose you for being Christian. So the ignorance that you're silencing is an ignorance about Jesus. So this is a witness issue. Like your good citizenness helps their ignorance about Jesus in some way. Because they go, oh man, like, they're having a hard time and they have every reason to rebel, but they're being good citizens. Like, well, what's the deal with that? So this is a witness issue. And of course, that means we got to pray for the government. This is what 1 Timothy 2 says. First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all those who are in high positions, that we may lead peaceful and quiet lives, godly and dignified in every way. So, did you get that? He's saying we got to pray for the kings and emperors and governing authorities so that they can rule well, so that we live peaceful, godly lives. I don't know if you know who David Platt is. He's a pastor. Anyone know who he is? Yeah, okay. He's a pastor over in the States, and he got a lot of flack from Christians because he didn't like Donald. I'm sure he didn't hate him, but he just wasn't pro-Donald Trump. And so people were like, he's woke. He's not woke. But Donald Trump actually came to his church while he was, passing through. Anyway, he was at his church. And so what David Platt did is he got President Trump up on stage, and he prayed for him. And people, it involves Donald Trump, so of course there was controversy. And people were like, well, how can you do that? He's blah, 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 blah. And he was just like, oh, look, love him, hate him, whatever. I'm just obeying this text to pray for our leaders, right? So this is what we have to do. So when's the election? October something. So when October something comes along and the party that you vote for doesn't win, and insert name here, becomes the prime minister, we have a duty as Christians, we got to pray for them. So, sometimes people are like, Jacinda Ardern, not my prime minister. She's not my prime minister either, because she's not the prime minister. But Chris Hipkins, like, not my prime minister, it doesn't matter. Like, we pray for whoever's in power. That's what Christians do. We respect the government and we submit. Okay, number 3. We're going to talk about voting. We're going to talk about voting. We responsibly cast our votes. So, you're probably like, hey, cool. I know I'm supposed to keep to the speed limit, but how should I vote? So three suggestions that I think come from inferences that come from this text that can help us when we talk about voting and voting responsibly. Are you guys familiar with Jeremiah 29:11? Yes, someone in this room's probably got it on their Insta bio or tattooed somewhere. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper, blah, blah, blah. So that's a really famous passage. But just before that, God, speaking through the prophet Jeremiah, says this. He says, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile. So the Jewish people, they've been exiled from their land, okay? So it's kind of similar themes to 1 Peter. They've been exiled from their land, and they're like, man, this sucks, this is terrible. Like, we don't have our temple, we don't have the promised land, we're losing our identity as a people. But God promises them, hey, like, don't worry. This is where Jeremiah 29:11 comes in. Like, don't worry, man, I know the plans I got for you. Don't worry, I got you. I'm going to stay true to the covenant. So, but before that, he says, the city where I've sent you into exile, pray to the Lord on its behalf, Babylon, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. So the inference is that even for those of us who are exiles, and this is not our home, kind of like what we opened with, we still have a responsibility, I think, an inference that I think we need to vote, or we should vote, and that we should vote responsibly. Because even though this isn't our home, we should pray and by inference vote for the welfare of our city. So, first of all, we need to vote with God in mind. Remember, we are servants of God. Thank you. Yep. So, first and foremost, we are servants of God, so we vote with God in mind. When I was year 13, it was called 7th form back then. No, it wasn't. That was the first time it got changed into years. When I was year 13, it was an election year, or the year after was an election year. So the point is, as those of us who were graduating high school, politics was on our mind. And I remember a mate of mine who said, Christian guy, I came here for a little bit actually. He said like, oh yeah, when I vote, I'm going to put my religion aside and just look at the politics and look at it impartially. And everyone thought, oh, yeah, man, like, look at him, he's so impartial and blah, blah, blah. And I always just thought, like, man, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Bro, I'm such a jerk. I just thought it wasn't that smart because it just revealed a terrible understanding of how one's worldview works. So your worldview, everyone has a worldview, is how we understand the world, the lens through which we see the world. And everyone has a worldview, and think of it like this. Here's my little cup of tea. Suppose, I didn't plan to have this. Suppose this cup of tea is my worldview. It's how I understand the world. And let's just say I have all these different drinks here, and this can of Coke here, it represents me growing up as a Korean. Because growing up as a Korean, it's shaped how I understand the world, okay? So we pour that into there, and then we grab this Sprite, and it represents growing up as a male. Because that's shaped how I understand the world. Pour that into there, and grab this orange juice, and the orange juice is growing up on the North Shore. That's shaped my worldview. Get some salt water, and that represents the Bible. There you go. And how growing up in a Christian home, how that's, chuck it all in there, mix it all up. That's my worldview, right? And if you were to say to me, oh, hey, when you think about this, just remove the religion or the Christian aspect of it. Is trying to like get in there and be like, oh, sweet, let's just take that drink out of there. It doesn't work like that. You have a worldview, and all these different things have shaped that worldview, so you can't just split when you're thinking about voting, you can't just be like, oh, no, I'm going to be noble, and I'm not going to let my religion interfere with that. No. First of all, you can't separate it. And number two, greater than that, as servants of God and the biblical worldview should be the driving force. Like that's the filter through which we understand everything, not just voting. So we vote as servants of God with God in mind. But it also means that we don't vote, that I think we shouldn't vote with just you in mind, right? Because we love God, and then what's the second one? Yeah, love others, okay? So as we think about voting, we think of it with God in mind, and because we think with God in mind, whoever you vote for, just don't be selfish, please. Christians, we're not selfish people. So we vote for others in mind as well. Number 2, we vote with the government's role in mind. So this passage tells us something about the role of government. This is what Romans 13 says. The government is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. The Bible tells us that the government is God's avenger. So when you think like Avengers, you think of like Iron Man and Captain America and stuff, but actually, biblically, the Avengers are, Chris Hipkins, and I literally don't know any other person in the Labour Party, but I guess that wouldn't sell that many tickets. But the government has a specific role. In our text tonight, it says the government was sent by God, to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. This is the role of government, to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. So when we're thinking about voting for a party, and we've got to keep that in mind, what is the appropriate role of the government and what reflects that? So in the world that we live in today, can we agree it's a bit weird? The world's a bit weird. It's a bit messed up. And some people will try to glorify what God hates and say what God likes is bad. And so we got to be thoughtful about this. God says this is the specific role of government, and I think we should keep that in mind. It says the government should promote good, promote that which is good. So you might ask, okay, what does that mean? What does good mean? And if you've got your Bible in front of you, then what you'll notice is that also in that same pericope means like that chunk of text. In the same pericope, Christians are told to do good. Okay, so government, praise those who do good. Christians do good. So in some way, shape, or form, there seems to be a link between this idea of good. So I guess an easy way to understand it is whatever for a Christian, whatever we understand for it means for us to do good, that can help us understand what it means for the government to praise those who do good. And so for Christians, we want to promote good things. We want to promote peace. We want to promote justice. We want to promote all these kind of good things that you can think about. That's probably what this text is getting at when it says, praise those who do good. That's what Christians should be doing. So when you look at a party and they celebrate what God says is evil, then red flag. Got to consider that. Thirdly, we vote with goodness in mind. The text tells us that we should use our freedom as a cover. Don't use your freedom as a cover up for evil. And obviously, the text also tells us by doing good. We've got to do good and not let our actions be a cover up for evil. Okay, we vote with goodness in mind. Christians have an important role to play when it comes to, calling out or fixing bad worldviews or bad institutions or evil things that happen in the world. Remember, this text has just said that we are the people who are doing good. We promote goodness. Our influence on the society should be that of goodness. Okay, so Christians have been the people who have spoken out against abortion, against sexism, against slavery, against all these bad things that exist in the world. We have a great heritage of Christians standing up against these things. And so I think when it comes to voting, these are things that we got to think about. We vote to bring goodness into the world and try not to cover up for evil. Check these couple of proverbs out. Proverbs 31. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. Proverbs 24. Rescue those who are being taken away to death. Hold back those who are stumbling to the slaughter. So, I think when it comes to voting, whoever you vote for, I think some inferences from this text is that we vote like a Christian, we vote with the appropriate role of government in mind, and we vote to bring about goodness. Okay, point number 4 is, and we're getting there, don't worry, those of you who are fading, Amori. So remember, our priority is the gospel. Our priority is the gospel. That's our focus. If you scroll up to 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, it says the focus on our pilgrimage in this world, whether it's politics or not, is to point people to Christ. It says, keep your conduct honorable, and apply this to politics. Keep your conduct honorable so that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. This is how hearts change. Through the gospel being seen in our lives and being preached with our lips. This is how hearts change. This is how families change and societies change and worlds change. Not through legislative laws, but through the gospel. This is our priority. In the Heidelberg Catechism, or in the New City Catechism, there's a question that says, hey, what is our hope in life and death? Does anyone know the answer to that? What is our only hope in life and death? I didn't hear it, but I'll say, yep. Our only hope in life and death is that we are not our own, but we belong to God. That's our only hope in life and death. Our hope in life and death is not that Greens win the election. Our hope in life and death isn't that we get a Christian party. Yeah, Freedom Party. I think, is that Brian Tamaki's party? I don't know. That's not our hope. That's not our hope. Our hope is that we belong to God, that people belong to God. So the gospel is our priority. I think the danger when it comes to politics is we have the danger of, because it's just so vitriolic, isn't it? And we have this danger of just like idolizing our political candidates, that we just gloss over any bad thing that they might do, and even if it disqualifies them from running for office, we're like, no, but whatever. And then we just like totally vilify the opposition, like, you must be such an idiot for voting, blah, blah, blah. But what I'm trying to get at is like, no, let's not do that. Let's remember our priority is the gospel, and if that's the case, then that's our priority. Like, even if you vote for the party that I detest, there's a witness at stake. I need to remember the gospel. So we need to do politics in a way that shows that Christ is our treasure, not politics. I say this with everything, right? Let the way that we use our money show that Christ is our treasure and money is not. Let the way that we play sports show that Christ is our treasure, not sports, and so on. Finally, we rest in God's sovereignty. When Donald Trump got elected, people lost their minds, man. Like, the world melted down, and people just thought, like, this is the end of the world. But do you know what happened? The world kept spinning. The gospel continued to be preached. Churches still continued the work of the Great Commission. And then you know what happened in the next election? They replaced Donald Trump with Joe Biden. And then the world melted down again. But then do you know what happened? The world kept spinning. The gospel continued to go forth. Jesus said this about his church. He said, man, the gates of Hades are not going to prevail against the church. So it doesn't matter whether National wins or Labour wins or Greens or ACT or Freedom or New Zealand or top, whatever, is not going to prevail against God's church. That's the promise. Like, we can trust God. Whoever wins this election, Church of Christ has the same mission. We're going to be okay. Will persecution come? Maybe. Who knows? Right? It's happened in history. 1 Peter. But we rest in the fact that God is sovereign. The Psalms tell us that our God is in the heavens. He does what? He does all that he pleases. God is on the throne. So we can rest in that regardless of who wins. So in closing, let's look at the last verse of our passage. How should Christians engage in politics? We should honor everyone. Don't be a jerk. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Keep in unity with the church, even if they disagree. Man, this is so important. Out there, people slit each other's throats over politics. In here, we've got to love the brotherhood. Doesn't matter if our voting is different, because our identity is not set on that, eh? Our priority is not that. So we love the brotherhood, honor the emperor, so we obey the government, but ultimately we fear God. He is the boss. God is our boss, and we can rest in the fact that he's wise, he loves us, he cares for his people, and he's promised we're going to be okay, and he's got us in his hands.